Welcome to today's seminar. We have Robert Pless from Washington University, St. Louis. He's a professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department. Professor Pless received his bachelor's degree in computer science from Cornell University and his PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park. In 2006, he received an NSF Career Award as a recognition, and his research focuses in data-driven approach to understanding motion and change in video with a current focus on long-term time-lapse imagery. So, welcome to Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having me. I'm excited to come and talk to you because I have a data set for which I don't really have a specific purpose in mind, and I'm excited for any and all kinds of ideas from any of you, and I really mean that. So if you have any ideas of things you'd actually want to use this for in a scientific sense, I'm happy to get email about it, or for an artistic sense, or whatever. I'm really happy to hear from anyone for any reason. So I'm going to talk about repurposing the world's webcams, and just as a quick notational thing, when I say webcam, I mean a camera that's mounted outdoors someplace that offers its images up through a website, as opposed to like the little camera that's on your computer that people also call webcams because you can do web chat with them and so on. So my definition of webcam is these outdoor cameras, and this title is a little bit of a lie because really what I hope to do eventually is repurpose outdoor webcams for environmental and atmospheric measurement. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the steps that we're trying to do to make that possible. But realistically, we're not quite there except for a few proof of concept ideas. And all of this project started with a undergraduate computer vision course, which I taught, where I taught face recognition as one of the lectures. And I assigned the Eigenfaces project, which is sort of a classic approach to face recognition, and it tries to come up with a way of recognizing faces using this technique called principal component analysis or singular value decomposition. And one of the students, as his final project, said, what happens if we run principal component analysis on images from a static camera that's just looking out at the world, which to my knowledge, nobody had really done before. So here's the view of St. Louis from outside of my lab. And we took a time lapse of this, which was about 3 hours long, and it was a partly cloudy day, so clouds were floating overhead. So we had this time lapse of this scene, and we ran principal component analysis. And principal component analysis on a set of images creates the mean image, and in this case, 15 overlay images. And these overlay images are ones that if you wanted to reconstruct any of the images in your original sequence, you could do that by taking the original image and adding or subtracting a little bit of each of these 15 overlay images. And if the principal component analysis solves for the best, however many you want, in this case 15, in terms of being able to reconstruct the original images as best as possible. And just to ground this, what I mean by adding or subtracting, if I was to add a little bit of this image to this mean image, that would make all the trees a little bit lighter, which might be the case if the trees weren't in shadow. And if I was to add this image, that would make this part of the building a little brighter and this particular set of buildings in the background a little bit darker. And so that's how principal component analysis decomposes this image sequence into these components. And I decided to take 3 of these and make them the red, green, and blue channel of a false color image, just kind of for fun as a visualization tool. So the next image I'm going to show you is a color image where this is the red channel, this is the green channel, this is the blue channel. And you get this picture of downtown St. Louis, which besides being maybe a little bit pretty, also highlights a lot of St. Louis geography because it turns out that these buildings in blue are 10 miles away. They're all the way downtown in St. Louis. The buildings in dark green are at St. Louis University. That's about 6 miles away. And the buildings in light yellow are at the WashU Medical School. That's about 3 miles away. And here's the overhead map. And St. Louis is sort of a city that hasn't had the growth that some cities have. So there really aren't buildings in between these areas. So there's really sort of 3 areas where there's buildings. And to some extent, this is one of the holy grails of computer vision, to be able to take an image, set up a camera somewhere, look out, and find depth in this scene. Right? Like these pixels are now essentially color-coded by how far away from the camera they are. And so why is it that principal component analysis gave us something so compelling? Because PCA is one of the world's easiest tools ever. And the answer is that the natural world has a lot of structure in it. And so as clouds would go over this scene, often it was the case that all of the buildings in the medical school were under a cloud or they weren't. Or all the buildings at St. Louis University were under a cloud or they won't. So it made a lot of sense to take one of your overlay images and say, let's make all of these pixels darker in a way that corresponds to that area being under a cloud or not. And so this got me excited because it's a really easy statistical tool. It pulls out something really compelling from a set of images in a really unstructured, no-fuss way. And I started showing this kind of picture to my friends at computer vision conferences. And they said, Robert, this is fun, but you can't just get a data set to work with your algorithm with one camera and claim success. And so I said, the heck with you guys. We're going to do this at scale. And so we're now logging images from all publicly available webcams to try to see if simple statistical techniques like this work to give us interesting structure about outdoor scenes. And so I'm going to talk more about this at the very end. But we have a data set called AMOS, the Archive of Many Outdoor Scenes. Every green dot is one of the webcams that we're logging. And our goal is to try to use these cameras as an alternative to satellite imaging for large-scale environmental change analysis. And I like that goal because these cameras, they're not quite everywhere. It's not like we have an even sampling over all of the ocean areas. But especially in North America and Europe, we have a really dense sampling. And these cameras, compared to satellite images, are interesting because they're underneath the clouds. So when satellites can't see, you can still see with these cameras. They look sideways. They're all over the place. So this is the Scott Base and the Antarctic. They look sideways, so you can see things like how high different cloud and particulate layers are, which is something that's really hard to analyze from satellites. And they see things like individual trees. And that's interesting because climate change is a problem that's a global problem, but it resolves itself in terms of changes to individual trees and timing things between things that are very local. And so a satellite picture that summarizes this whole area as one pixel doesn't have resolution to say that these are the trees that are getting green earlier this year than last year. And so the fact that we have all these cameras out there gives us a very different kind of view than satellite imagery gives you in terms of understanding how the climate is changing. And it might be really expensive to set all these cameras up, but they're already there. They're already there in terms of highway traffic cams, beach resort cams, ski resort cams. Breckenridge has 17 cameras that look out and see a lot of the tree cover on the mountains. And especially pretty places that have a lot of trees around them, like they already have chosen to put cameras up. So these cameras are already there. And our goal now is to just try to organize that set of cameras that already exists in order to understand and make measurements from that scene. I adore questions, so if you have questions. Yes?
So the feed to the camera is publicly available, or how do you arrange that?
Yes, all these cameras. So WashU has a campus quad cam, so wustl.edu/webcam/quad.jpg. If you go to that, that gives you an image in your web browser. And if you right-click and save as, then you save the image to your disk. And so we have a little Java program that just does that all day, every day, all the time.
What is the time scale? You show the PCA that was for a year?
So the picture I showed at first was the PCA over the course of 2 hours in one afternoon for a camera that we set up. One of the interesting questions that I'll get to is PCA at different time scales can show interestingly different ways of slicing up this data. All right. So we have these pictures. They're all over the place. They're underneath the clouds. And for each camera, just to drive this point home, for each camera we have many years worth of data. And here's a summary of 1 year's worth of data in a plot that is time of year by time of day for the whole year, sort of particular selected days. And it really highlights interesting features of like the way tree vegetation changes, the way the lighting changes the appearance of the scene, the fact that the days are longer in the summer than they are in the winter are all captured in this summary image. And so we have this kind of summary image for our 17,000 cameras. All right, so I think it's kind of fun to say just a little bit about how we generated this data set. So the first thing we did is we needed to find cameras. And you can find cameras in lots of ways. One of them is clever Google searches. So if you search for things that are only likely to appear on web pages that are created when somebody installs a webcam and it automatically makes a web page, you can find tens of thousands of cameras. And so here's an example of one of those searches. This is kind of the most fun. I also hired 2 undergrads to spend the whole summer finding webcams for me. They went to every state and looked up the Department of Transportation, the Department of Parks, the Department of Natural Resources, every country. And so, but this one got us a lot. And so you do a Google search and you get the URL of some camera. And so then you go to that page. And here is the page for that camera. So now if you right-click on this, then you can save as, you can save that image. But one of the interesting things is you may not know anything about this camera. And before this is useful, you want to know where the camera is located, something about how it's calibrated, and maybe something about what's in the scene. And so the first couple things I'm going to talk about today are how do you go about trying to geolocate and calibrating this camera. And our model is that we have images from this camera, and we know when we captured the images, but we may not know anything else about the cameras at all. Questions? All right, so here is the way that we try to structure thinking about our set of cameras. And it's a little bit of a complicated model, and it's sort of set up as a generative model that says, if I want to generate what an image looks like, the first thing I have to tell you is where you're located and what time it is. Right? And if you know that, then that sort of specifies what the scene is. So once you tell me where you are, you might know the scene structure, meaning how far away things are and what their surface normal is, what direction the edges are pointed in, what color, what's the true surface reflectance of those areas. There may or may not be transient objects like cabs driving through the scenes or birds. There may be some weather, either partly cloudy or lightning or storm. And there may be lighting that can be defined by the location and the time because the sun is going to be in some particular height and location in the sky at a given time. Or there could be, like in the night, there could be different times when street lights are on or off or so on. But once you know the location and the time, you can, like, these are all at least defined things. You may not know them, but they're defined things. And they all create what we call the view sphere, or the panorama of pictures that you could take from that location. And then if you actually want to turn that into a specific image, you need to know what direction the camera is pointed in, what the intrinsic calibration of the camera is, meaning how zoomed in it is, how it translates real-world colors into the colors that it shows on the image, and maybe there's some imaging noise also. And so this is our generative model, and we never really think about priors and probabilities explicitly over all of this, but we use this to try to structure our way of decomposing a very long set of images that we definitely know what time they're captured, and occasionally we'll talk about knowing, assuming that we know other things. And I should highlight that this was the PhD thesis of my last PhD student, who's now at the University of Kentucky, but he's the one that took my vague ideas about PCA and kind of put it into a nice structure like this. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is to say we went out and found the URLs of a bunch of webcams, and before they're useful for anything at all, we need to know where in the world they are. And so how can we figure out where in the world they are? So our idea is we're going to say we know what the capture time of the image was. We've measured the image. We've captured the image. We're looking for the geolocation, and we're going to try to use the cue of lighting and try to ignore as much of these other things as possible. And so geolocation is kind of a fun problem because it's a very, very specific problem. I've given a set of images from a camera. I want to know what is the lat-long coordinate. It's no fuzzy like, is that a chair? And then you don't know if it's a stool should count as a chair. There's a lot of vision problems that are kind of ugly, right? But this is a really clean problem. And it turns out to have a really clean solution. So if I look at images over the course of a year, we can see that it's dark, it's dark, it's dark, it's light, it's light, it's light, it's light, it's dark, it's dark, it's dark. And so that pattern of when it's daytime at a particular is unique to the latitude, longitude, location of the year. So if you just look up when dawn is, that tells you roughly the longitude. And if you look at the length of the day, that gives you an approximation of the latitude. And if you look at any one day, it might be complicated because some days it's, like it's cloudy, so it seems to get dark a little bit earlier. But if you say, if I hypothesize a particular latitude, longitude, location, I'll get some pattern of where the dawn-dusk line should be. And I ask, how well does this data fit that latitude, longitude line? And you can geolocate the camera. And that gives you geolocation accuracy, in part because we're only capturing images every half hour. But that gives us geolocation accuracy within about 100 miles for most cameras. So 100 miles is a long way, but it's pretty specific relative to not knowing where on the planet it is. So now we can try to do the same thing by saying, I want to use the images captured at a known time. I want to solve for the geolocation, but let's try to solve for the geolocation with weather. So this gets to your question a little bit. It says, let's take a bunch of images from one of our camera, and let's take pictures only at noon every day for a month. And so by taking pictures only at noon every day for a month, I'm trying to factor out any variation by where the sun is. And so what is the dominant reason that an outdoor scene would change at noon every day of the month? It's whether or not it's cloudy. So if you run PCA on that strip of images, on almost every camera you get if you run PCA on that set of images, and you sort them by the first principal component coefficient, how much of that first overlay you needed to add. In almost every camera, it goes cloudy to sunny or sunny to cloudy, but that's the coefficient. That's what the coefficient is coding for. So here it's sunny to cloudy, sunny to cloudy, sunny to cloudy. Every once in a while, there's a scene that goes from weekday to weekend, I imagine, because these cars are like if you're in the working world, it doesn't matter if it's cloudy or sunny. That just ruins your life, right? So what does this mean that I can make this first principal component coefficient and get a cloudy or sunny signature? That means I can find for that camera a really easy way of saying for this month, cloudy, 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 sunny, 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 cloudy, sunny, sunny, cloudy at noon for those days. So then I can go and look at a satellite map and say which pixel in that satellite map has the same signature of cloudy, 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 sunny, 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 cloudy, sunny, sunny. Right? And so that gives us geolocation accuracy. So you can pick that satellite pixel, and we can get we can find what the location is, and so we did this on cameras for which we knew the ground truth location, and we get errors, and sometimes these are even kind of fun because this is a camera that you'll notice doesn't see the sky at all. But if it's sunny out, there's a harsh shadow in the scene. If it's not sunny, there isn't a harsh shadow in the scene. That's still the dominant principal component coefficient. And so it's not that we have to actually look at the clouds. It's just a sort of a fact of outdoor imagery that cloudy or sunny is the dominant cause of change. And so this is one, this has, I think this was like a 4-mile error, which is unnaturally high. But we were really excited that the really closest one was not the one that is, it's not even looking at the sky. And I think here's our error histogram. So we get 80% of our cameras are geolocalized within 50 miles using this satellite estimate. So this is one way that we can take our graphical model and try to infer parts of these variables. And so that was fun because that's the first way we can start saying, I have images from some unknown camera, and before I can use it for anything else, I at least want to know where in the world the camera is. Once you know where the camera is, then it becomes easier to use this kind of model because you know more things. In particular, if you suppose that you know the geolocation and you know when the picture was taken, then you could know exactly where the sun should be relative to the camera because you're saying, I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and it's 3:15 p.m. on this date, right? So the sun has some particular azimuth and elevation. You should be able to point to where the sun is. Maybe it's cloudy, but if it's not cloudy, you should be able to point to exactly where the sun is. So the next thing we wanted to look at is, can we understand more about the 3D structure of the scene just from these somewhat unorganized images? So we know the geolocation, we know the capture time, therefore we know what the lighting direction is. And we're interested in trying to solve for the scene structure of that scene. All right. So here we took PCA again. And this time, the way we did PCA is we wanted to try to factor out the variations due to weather. So we took a mean image over the course. We took a month, and we made the mean 8 a.m. image, and the mean 8:30 a.m. image, and the mean 9 a.m. image, and the mean 9:30 a.m. image, and the mean 10 a.m. image. So we did the mean day for that month. And the idea of having the mean day is I didn't want to go through and pick out which days were cloudy and partly and partly sunny. And so this factored out all of the variations because of that kind of weather. And then for those for that one day video that was made up out of the month's worth of video, we took the PCA decomposition, and I'm not showing you the overlay images. I'm just showing you the amount of the coefficients we needed to add to the mean image in order to reconstruct the images at the different times of day. All right, so this says at midnight, I take negative of the first overlay until sort of dawn time, and then I use a lot of the first overlay, and the second overlay, I don't use it all at the nighttime, and I use more of it in the morning, and I subtract it in the evening, and so on. So if you run PCA on this set of images for one, so this PCA is defined just for the set of images from one camera, and you get these coefficient trajectories. And you take a totally different data set, so a different camera, but the same image over the course of the day, you get another set of coefficient trajectories. You take the same data set in another camera, you get different and what we noticed is that these coefficient trajectories look relatively similar. Right? For most cameras, there's a huge difference between, this isn't maybe a real surprise, right? There's a big change for most cameras from nighttime to daytime. There's a big change from morning to evening. But it was still compelling that these pictures looked really similar. So there's a tool for trying to merge these coefficient trajectories into one coherent set. And so we wanted to make all the coefficients the same. And that might change what the overlay images are, because we're enforcing that the coefficient trajectory is the same, but then each camera gets its own overlay images to say, how does that camera react to these coefficients? And so this becomes a tensor factorization problem. Who's heard of tensors? Who's never heard of tensors? Just think of them as 3D matrices. That's all they are. So in this case, we have a 3D matrix. So we take a set of the set of images from one camera becomes a regular 2D matrix. We take this image, it becomes one column. The next image becomes the next column. So this gives me the data matrix for one camera. And then we stack the data matrices for the next camera in front of that. And so we get a 3D data volume. And we had to compress all the images at the same size and so on. So this 3D data volume is which pixel you are in going up this axis, and which day it is, or which time of day it is going across this axis, and which camera it is going along this axis. And we used the fact that we knew what time of day these these images were captured to align all of these by dawn and dusk time. So we have a normalized day, so we have a normalized day. And then we wanted to decompose those into a time sequence that was consistent for all the cameras. And then each camera gets its own overlay images, its own basis that apply to that time sequence. And so tensor factorization is a pretty standard operation. There's MATLAB toolboxes that do it for you. It's not quite as straightforward as principal component analysis. There's a couple different ways to try to do it, but at least it's a well-defined problem, so we can solve for this. And the idea of this is we should now get false color images, like the one I showed before that showed St. Louis at different depths, and they should be comparable between all the cameras. And also, they should highlight something that relates to what these coefficients look like. So the first component should be basically, what is the big change between dawn and dusk? Between night and day. And the second coefficient should be, what is the big change between morning and evening? And the third coefficient should be, what is the big change between dawn, dusk versus the middle of the day? So if we do that, here are the types of component images that we get that you add and subtract. And even here you can start seeing this structure that, like, the dawn and dusk. Dawn and dusk. I don't actually know what this picture is trying to say. Let's skip it. Right, okay. So this is the color version of the first three principal components. The color doesn't ever tell you that much. So this is the black and white version. So this is the big difference. This is the difference in terms of the black and white image. I guess this is the difference in terms of the color image of how the scene changes from night to day. And this is the color version of how it changes, but relating like dawn and dusk versus the middle of the day. And this is the morning this one is the morning versus the evening. And so here you can see that the big change in morning versus evening is one side of this tower is bright, and this side of the building is bright, and the other side, which is lit only in the afternoon, is the dark side. And here you can see the sky is really white, so the sky is going to change a lot between night and day. So then we took these three. I love making false color-coded images. So we take these three and make one red, one green, and one blue to give one single image that can highlight all of this. And so that gives us a color-coded image where especially like the red channel is related to, so the green turns out to be, it's red, green, and blue. So green turns out to be the things that are facing straight up because they're brightest in the middle of the day relative to dawn and dusk. And then the blue channel relates to what the orientation of that. And these are all consistent now between multiple different cameras. So because this was based on a tensor factorization that's consistent across all cameras. So now this is Washue's quad. I happen to know that this building is facing east. And so I get this idea like this orangish purplish color. It's kind of like this orange color. Like those are all eastward facing walls. Even though I don't know what direction my camera is facing, that wall has a time sequence over the course of the day that is consistent with it being eastward facing. So that's not a metric answer. That's not telling me exactly how it's eastward facing, but it gives us consistency across different images. Questions?
You get the direction of the camera.
Could you get the direction? So you could get the direction of the camera. We haven't gone through and done that from this data set yet. Right, so you know it's facing kind of west right now. If this wall is slanted a little bit away from the camera, So you'd have to do inference maybe that like the vanishing point of these lines are way over there in order to differentiate it from the camera being slightly on the other side of the building. You could certainly do like, you only see the surface normals that are facing you, right? So you could make some you could make some bounds on what the orientation of the camera could be. All right, so that was an example of trying to solve for the surface normals using the known location and capture time, which tells us something about the lighting, and then actually looking at the images to do inference on what happens at each pixel. We also want to think about maybe a little bit more deeper use of the variations in natural scenes. So natural scenes are fun. Like I like coming to Colorado because you can look at the mountains and they're interesting to look at, right? And they're interesting not just because they're different in the morning and the evening, right? So we can use different types of variation. And so if we want to use variation, oops, that was supposed to go over weather. Okay, so imagine that we say, I want to look at the variation in weather now. And instead of getting surface normals, I want to understand more formally how far away things in the scene are. So what is the depth of points in the scene? So here's a time lapse. This actually isn't from one of our webcams, but it's just the most beautiful time lapse I've seen. And so here we have variations in what this scene looks like that vary because the weather is changing and the clouds are going overhead. And in particular, I want you to look at the clouds as they pass over these areas, because this is the cue we're going to use to say, like we did in looking at downtown St. Louis, the areas that have exactly the same patterns of clouds going overhead are going to be more similar in depth than things that don't. And we're going to try to be a little bit more formal than just running PCA. So this gets to be kind of fun. So the spatial cue here is that if I have 2 pixels and I'm looking at them from straight above, the closer those 2 pixels are together, if you have a formal model of clouds being some random process that generates maybe different sized clouds at different locations on the image, the closer together in the world 2 pixels are, the more often they're going to have exactly the same pattern of light and dark. And so that's especially, so here's the model of what clouds look like. Sometimes animations sound like a good idea when you're making them. All right, and then if we look at the time sequence, all right, I've given away a little. If we look at the time sequence of these 2 pixels, they're going to have some correlation, and the idea is that correlation is going to depend on how far away they are. And so just to validate this, maybe that's completely obvious, but just to validate this, we went to a satellite map where we knew exactly how far away different pixels were. We took a couple hundred images of every half-hour infrared satellite weather data, so it was always at night, so it was easy to, so we didn't have to worry about the day-night transition. And then we look at the correlation between 2 different pixels, and we plot the correlation versus how far away those pixels were in real space. And so here's the scatter plot. And it says that the correlation is essentially 1 if the pixels are very close together, and the correlation decreases as the distance gets higher. And there's some noise. Probably if we were to run this for a lot more images, the noise would go down. But maybe not completely down, because it might be that at some parts of the ocean, like near the Arctic Circle or something, there's just clouds all the time, so they're more likely to stay correlated than pixels in other locations. If we measure the time sequence of intensity at each pixel, that gives me a 1D signal. And so I just do the correlation of the 1D signals at two different locations.
So like only a pixel in each camera?
So this is a satellite image, and so it's just that pixel of the satellite image. And so we're not comparing. Nowhere in this are we going to compare across cameras. So either we're going to do. So we're just doing this to validate this idea that points farther apart have different correlations.
It's a satellite infrared only.
That's right. And then when we go back to our original image, we're going to correlate the time sequence at, say, one particular pixel versus the time sequence at another pixel. We're going to do it for all pairs of pixels. OK, so this is nice because it gives us an idea that if I measure the correlation on the image, I'll get a sense of what the distance is, between the real world distance is between the 2 pixels that image looks at. So there's a tool called multidimensional scaling that I've heard a couple of people talk about already today that says, suppose I have the distances between a whole bunch of collections of points, and I want to solve for what 3D structure corresponds to that set of pairwise distances. we may not know exactly what the distance between all the pairs of points is because we have this correlation to distance mapping that we don't know, right? Maybe we know it in this particular scene, but we already know, we measured this by knowing what the scene looked like. So our philosophy in this is that it's really easy to go and find a particular pixel, measure its time sequence, and measure the time sequence of all the other pixels in the scene, and come up with this correlation mapping from this pixel to all these other pixels. So we can do this for all pairs of pixels, or for every pixel from a bunch of landmark pixels to all the rest. And then we want to go and translate that into distances between all the pixels. So this is the correlation. I kind of like this picture because it looks like God's flashlight to me. It's like God showing a flashlight from straight overhead, and now it's illuminating points by how far away they are from this landmark pixel. So if we do this to a couple different pixels, the things in the foreground, it seems like God has a bigger flashlight, but that's just because it's closer to you, so it looks bigger on the image. The things that are far away, it's still just the pixels that are the same distance away that have this similar correlation. Like the distance between this pixel and the one that sort of starts to be yellow, the real world distance between those two is the same as the real world distance between here, or that's our assumption. And you can see these correlations for a couple of different landmark pixels. So those correlations relate to the depth, but we don't know how they relate to the depth. So there's a tool called non-metric multidimensional scaling, which says, suppose I have some number that corresponds to depth, but it has some monotonic but otherwise unknown relationship, so that the less correlated it is, the farther away we think it is, but we don't know what that mapping is. So the algorithmic approach here is to say, let's try to simultaneously solve for the 3D structure of all the points in this scene, and solve for the correlation to distance mapping, so that points at a particular distance in the model that we're assuming has the pairs of points with the distance in the model that we create has a correlation, and that correlation is consistent for all the pixels. All right, so we're trying to solve for what is that mapping. And this mapping changes for different types of scenes. And so it's important that there's no way to solve for it for all scenes. It depends on, at the very least, the scale of the scene and how big the clouds in that scene are and how long of a time you've captured data for. All right, so here's our algorithmic overview. So this is not a well-defined, formally proven theory in the way that Francois and some of the people like to do work here, but it's an algorithmic approach that converges really quickly and creates pretty pictures. So our approach is to say we can just start by computing correlations between pairs of points. We only ever have to do that once. We have real image data. There's pixels in that image data. We have a time series at each pixel. We compute the correlation between that time series. That will never change. But I can't make that scatter plot yet because I don't know what the depth between what the depth of the points is or what the distance between the points is. So we're going to make an initial depth map by assuming the world is planar. And we have sort of a dirty hack for initializing that planar assumption. But we're going to assume that the world is planar. And so once I make that assumption, this point and this point have some estimated distance between them. And so I can make my scatter plot that relates the distance and the time series correlation. So I make that distance and the time series correlation. And now that I have a distance to time series correlation, I can go through and take every pair of points. So some pair of points, this point and this point. I have some correlation, and I can look up how far apart those points should be. So now that I've looked up how far apart those points should be, I have an estimated distance between that pair of points. I actually have that between every pair of points. So now I can use standard multidimensional scaling to hypothesize what 3D structure of the world is consistent with that set of distances. Is everybody happy? So now I have a structure of the world. That structure of the world may not have exactly the set of distances that I just got between those 2 points, because I'm solving multidimensional scaling, which may give me a different answer. So now I have a new set of distances between all the pairs of points. So now I can make a new distance to correlation map. So then I have a new distance to correlation map. I solve for a new set of distances between all pairs of points. Now I solve multidimensional scaling again, and I iterate. And here is that iteration happening. So here's the starting condition. And so what's going to happen when I animate this is, so here's the correlation. Here's the distance. Each one of these corresponds to a pair of points in the original scene. These points are going to migrate or evolve due to that iterative process. But all the points are only going to go up or down because we're not changing the correlation. We're just changing the distance implied by the multidimensional scaling solution. Oh, I hope these start at the same time. maybe it's animated. Is it animated? All right. And so as the depth map becomes cleaner and more realistic, then my distance to correlation map becomes a tighter distribution. And out pops a 3D model of the world. And at first I saw this, and I said, that looks really bad, because it looks like these buildings are closer here and farther there. But it's actually a whole series of buildings that really are going farther away. So that's accurate. Question?
Yes. Is there a way to sort of stabilize this beginning by working by the average intensity instead of just per pixel? So correlation within little blocks?
Is our way to stabilize at the beginning?
In some sense, you assume that the world is flat.
That's right.
It probably is flat, but not at the pixel scale, right?
Oh, right. So you're asking what was our approach to the initialization process?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Can you work with correlation between little blocks instead of pixels?
could you?
The average intensity within a block, and you measure the correlation to a larger scale.
So we wanted some global model because we wanted to see this with some model forever. So I think what we did is we tried all possible planes, all possible ground planes. For each ground plane, you get some picture like this, and then you look at the conditional entropy for each correlation bin, and just say how clean or dirty is this plot. So if I had some other plane, if I had some plane that was tipped sideways or something, this plot would have been even dirtier. And so that was our minimization criteria. Yes?
How long did your time lapse have to be to get really long?
That's a great question. So there's multiple answers to that. So it has to be long enough that, so if you imagine clouds as sort of random circles placed in the sky and moving around, it has to be long enough that no pixel that happened to, that are far apart just happen to luckily have the same pattern of clouds coming over it, which if it's a very short time lapse, right, there'll be, like if it's just a couple minutes, there'll be a couple locations where clouds just crossed over them. If you make it very long, then there are other image changes that come into play. So for instance, as the sun travels over the sky, right, one part of this building will become bright to dark, and you'll get the correlations between the orientation of the walls. So the ideal thing is as long as possible before the correlation based on surface normal starts to dominate. Or you can cheat and start computing something related to correlation, but correlation just within short chunks, so that like the correlation of this 10 minutes and then plus the correlation of this 10 minutes plus so that the long-term slow variations are don't affect the correlation. Question?
So how do AGCs or shutter time controls affect you in doing this? Because they'll change the intensity of the whole.
Oh, we hate automatic gain control, and to some extent, whole image variations don't affect this because they'll affect all the pixels, and so they're not going to affect the correlation, or certainly not the normalized cross correlation that balances out some of the variation. Yeah, we spend a lot of time trying to undo white balance and crap like that, and it makes our life miserable. Other questions? All right. So, and here's, now let's just show this. This is really nice when it converges like this. So there's some technical details in how we did this. So the distribution, we don't know this distribution of the distance to correlation. And so there's a really nice solution called monotonic regression or isotonic regression that works out to a nice linear program to say, solve for this curve that minimizes the variation. Like if you were to bin the points up into correlation bins like 0.95 to 1.0 and 0.9 to 0.95, minimize the variation within each of those bins, subject to a constraint that this is still a monotonic curve. And we liked the monotonic curve constraint because we felt that that was something that was fair to assume in any scene, that farther away points will have lower correlation, but we didn't want to assume that this was going to be linear or exponential or any other particular form, so we did this with an isotonic regression. So what are other things I want to point out here? So we ran this on a whole bunch of scenes. It was difficult to ground truth because we didn't have unknown geometry for the scenes that we happen to have videos of. We're working on that now. For some of these scenes that were a little closer up, we really like the fact that we get really high resolution of what the depth is in terms of spatial resolution, because we're doing this as a per pixel measure. We're not having to average over small patches in the image like so many image processing algorithms do. And scenes like this scene was much closer. This has a much more linear correlation. And that relates to the fact that I think the clouds were bigger relative to the scene size in this location. So that leads to a more linear correlation than when the scene is very big relative to the size of the clouds. Once you're pretty far away, you're going to have essentially zero correlation no matter how far away, so you get a less linear relationship. But the nearby scenes tend to have a very nice linear relationship. And one last picture, just because it's fun to show one last picture. Some of these locations in the image are not shown. So these dark pixels are locations that were shaded the entire time. And since this is a cue about the time series of light and dark, if there was something was shadowed all the time instead of just due to clouds, then you don't get any good constraint. And it's actually really important to take those out because they foul everything up. They foul everything up in particular because they tend to be very correlated with each other. Like anytime the automatic gain control changes the camera intensity, those pixels change in a correlated way. And then you're trying to do multidimensional scaling where that pixel wants to be really close to that pixel and it fouls everything up. Questions?
Have you validated those depth maps?
So on the first scene has this baseball diamond in it, but it was in the Czech Republic. And so once we created the depth, where is this? Once we created the depth map, we measured the depth map distance of this baseball field, and it was 99 feet in each axis, which we attribute to the Czechs not really being a baseball country and therefore building their field at the wrong. All right, so I'm going to go through one more example of how to try to use this, and this is a simple example. It's the one that we've actually gotten to an interesting endpoint at, and here we're interested in just understanding the albedo or the surface reflectance. And we didn't have to do any great big. We created an average image over the course of each day and just measured how green something was, and we did the normalization of dividing the green by the red, green, and blue at each pixel. So this is the world's simplest image processing. But I was trying to highlight that our webcam data set captures seasonal variations in these scenes and captures the fact that these trees are green, and then they're not green, or I guess they're green, and then it goes into the fall, and then loses its leaves entirely. And there was a guy out of Harvard who 4 years ago, I read a paper of his that says we've mounted 3 webcams in the Harvard research forest because we're worried that satellite imagery may not accurately capture when trees get green in the spring and when they lose their leaves in the fall. And it was really late at night when I read this. And so I wrote him an email and I said, 3 cameras, that's kind of amateur. Do you want to try 17,000? And he wrote back 3 minutes later and he said, I think I would. And so we've been working since then to try to use these set of webcams to really measure something that's interesting in a much bigger scale. And so for each of these scenes, we drew a small region of interest. We actually had Mechanical Turk, if you're familiar with that, draw a small region of interest around trees in the scene. So I think in this scene, there's a tree here. And here was a big region here. Here it was the trees that were in the background. Here it was the trees that were in the background. And we measure the greenness score and plot it as a function of days since the beginning of the year. And so you can see it's not quite as green, and then it becomes green. It's not quite as green, and then it becomes green. And we fit a sigmoid function to this and look at the sort of place where the sigmoid function gets between 10th and 90th percentile in the middle. And what we found when we compared this to satellite data, so here's a bigger example of this. What we found when we compared this to satellite data, or the MODIS satellite report that people use and actually is fed into the global climate change models, is that our data differed from the MODIS satellite data by up to a month. In this scene in particular, it was a month. And so for this year, for 2008, when this was, the MODIS data said March 22nd was the day that this area, sort of like the spring green up day, and everybody knows it's kind of a gradual thing, but they pick a day to specify. And so at first we're like, well, that's weird, it's off by a month. But we can look at ours, and we're pretty sure we're right. Like here we have this curve, and it's like there's no leaves in this tree, and then there start to be leaves in this tree, and then there are leaves in that tree, right? We're pretty sure we're right. And the satellite data sees all of this in much bigger areas, just 1 pixel. And especially, this turns out to be pervasive in areas like suburban areas or urban areas where there's trees not everywhere. And the reason is the grass turns green. And the satellite looks down and it has this great hyperspectral imager, and it looks for the chlorophyll signature in the hyperspectral imager, and it sees the grass, and the grass has chlorophyll in it, and it says, haha, this part of the scene has turned green. But in terms of carbon sequestration, it's the trees that are much more important than the grass. And so this is sort of interesting to know that those models are off by that much. Now, it's not actually a huge deal in the climate change world because there's a lot more trees in forested areas than there are trees in non-forested areas. But still, so we now have an ongoing project to try to estimate how green these are in a more formal way, and estimate not just how green they are, but when they start to turn yellow by really understanding what the colors are at this location, what the colors are in this image using our big geotemporal image formation model. And that project is putting up 100 towers with crazy sensors and cameras in it. And the goal is for us to see how many of the measurements from those towers we can extrapolate from all our webcams everywhere else. Questions? All right. So for the last couple minutes, I'd like to point you towards the website. This is a publicly available website. Anybody's welcome and encouraged to go there. There's a page where you can browse the current image from cameras. There really is a camera that has spent the last 5 years looking at a brick wall. I'm sure it was mounted looking at something else, but it fell over and now it just looks at a brick wall. And the page has a collection of user interface visualization tools. And my favorite is this time of day by time of year summary plot. So I showed one that was a whole picture from each time of day and time of year. But this just takes a pixel, and each pixel is the average intensity of the entire image, the image that was taken at that time of that day. And so for the Scott Basin, Antarctica, if you go from August to December, there's a time where night just ends because that now becomes daylight all the time. And we use this, so here's a couple of cruise ships. And so there's webcams mounted on cruise ships. They update, they show the picture from the front of the cruise ship, right? And these cruise ships are interesting because they go north and south and north and south, and so they go to places where the days are longer and shorter and longer and shorter. And this cruise ship, can anybody tell me what this cruise ship must have done over the course of this year? So it started off in like daytime kept getting later in the year, daytime kept getting later, daytime kept getting later, eventually it wrapped. So this cruise ship circumnavigated the world over the course of this year, right? So it had one fewer day, or one more day, I don't actually know which way it's going, one fewer day over the course of a year. So these summary images really tell a lot about what happened to a particular camera. And, oh man, there's two versions of the summary image we have. They both go time of day by time of year. One is the average intensity in the image, and the other one we've taken PCA, because that's all I do, PCA. PCA of all the images from that camera for the entire year. We compute the overlay images. We did PCA with 3 components, so each image has 3 coefficients. And then we made those coefficients the red, green, and blue channel in this summary image. And so you can see that there's a difference between nighttime and daytime, and there's often a difference between morning and evening. And in this camera, something happened between here and here. And we made this tool because often something happens. In this case, if I go from here to here, the camera shifts. And therefore, when you try to make one image from the other with these overlays, you basically have to have an overlay that subtracts out the whole dome from one image and adds it in, shift it over to the other image. And that's a huge change. And so you get this big variation. Yeah. All right. So I am happy to hear lots of questions. But the threat is if you don't ask questions, I'm going to show you another demo. But the questions will be way better than the demo. So I'd like to conclude just by saying thanks to people that have funded this work and all the students that worked on it. And thanks to you for letting me talk to you. Yeah?
Do you mind, what are the inputs when you do MDS? And also, why did you choose MDS?
So what is the input? So MDS is a part of this algorithm. And so once I have, so we have the correlations between points. Once I have a depth map, then I have a way of translating those correlations into distances. So then I have distances between every pair of points. So that's the input to MDS. And then MDS outputs point locations in 3D. And we had to do one further step that we know that our points have to lie, like a particular pixel has to lie along some ray in space. So naturally, MDS would just say, here's a location where all your points could lie in 3D. We have to constrain that to say the points have to lie along these rays in space. But that turns out to be really easy and natural to put into the MDS constraint. So we did this constrained MDS problem based on the distances that were imputed by the current correlation to distance mapping. That was the input to MDS. Yeah?
Would it help if all the cameras were the same?
Would it help if all the cameras were the same? So I guess cameras can be different in all sorts of ways, right? Like the size of the image is something that's easy to normalize. The automatic gain control is something that makes our life miserable, but if you didn't have that, then your image would be black almost all the time. Like it would be black for all the nights and most of the mornings, right? Like so the fact that they automatically adjust, right, is like they adjust to make the images pretty and informative to us, right? What I would really like is if they all had the EXIF data of what transform they applied, right? Because then we could undo it instead of having to infer it, which, but if they did that, like I would love to have the default that the cameras at least report what they did.
17,000 looks like a lot, but the camera costs maybe $10. And so by the days of the NSF grant, you can buy 10,000 cameras.
That's right, but it's buying them and then installing them and then maintaining them, and it's the installation and maintenance that is the and like the wire to the camera, right? Is
10,000 offers.
We have ongoing work that tries to explore citizen science approaches to specifying locations in the world that it would be interesting to some project to have a picture taken, and then making an interface that makes it easy to take a picture from exactly the same viewpoint as the last person took a picture of the location, which we tried lots of complicated things, but the only thing that worked is just showing the previous picture half see-through, right? So then you can see, like, and line it up yourself and then take the picture. Yeah?
So referring back to your principal components analysis, since there's primarily one degree of freedom behind the image, which is the angle of the sun, for the most part, you would think that the principal components themselves, even though they're uncorrelated, that they would be statistically dependent. And I'm wondering if you've looked for statistical dependencies amongst those coefficients, higher order than just linear decorrelation.
Yeah, there are certainly statistically correlated. They often lie on a circle, right? Like they're uncorrelated, but they lie on a circle, and the cloudy days are all a mess in the middle. But the days when it's sunny, they're like nicely on a circle. We haven't explicitly looked for that very much, mostly because we know the time of day. So if we want to do that decomposition, we can condition things on the time of day. Yeah, like I guess I'd be interested.
Independent components analysis is a general set misunderstood.
Okay.
ICA.
Yeah, we've explored that a little bit. ICA algorithms tend to be a lot slower than PCA, and I don't know of any incremental ICA algorithms. And so when we're doing PCA on the 15,000 images over the course of a year, it's vital that it's incremental. And so if you've ever heard of incremental ICA, I would love to hear about it. Yeah?
So you're leveraging sort of temporal variations in unit, right? But in urban environment, a lot of those are due to sort of human activities. How do you remove that? Do you have automated ways to get rid of people, their cars, and their trucks and whatnot?
I think I love this picture, this kind of way of organizing things, but it hides lots of things, right? And so one of the things it hides is, like this is a way of understanding the creation of one image, right? But if you think about this as temporal variations, some of these things relate to very different time scales, right? So like the lighting depends on like time of day, right? And so a couple minutes later, rarely does the lighting change unless you have clouds, right? And the transient objects is sort of my reminder to myself that there's like, I guess the scene structure and color is just a scene structure and color. the transient objects could be included in that, right? At a given time, there's a scene structure that includes the transient objects. But that's so often something we're worried about that we almost always, when we're trying to avoid things like that, averaging over hours or days to try to get rid of cars and people and things like that in the middle of it. We haven't done a lot with trying to exploit the statistics of where people are moving in a scene, because that could be a great way to label like where are traffic lanes, automatically find traffic lanes as the place that vary at a very high time frequency. And we haven't done that in a long-winded way. Yeah?
You teased the guy from Harvard with 17,000 cameras, but you didn't use 17,000 cameras. You don't have all of those with trees. You selected some of them.
Right. So to date, we did the proof of concept with about 110 cameras. And we have just put out the Mechanical Turk job to draw the bounding boxes and all the rest of them. And so we think we'll get like 6,000 cameras with trees in it, is our estimate.
You explain how you use the mechanism, how you select the cameras. Do you go yourself, camera by camera, and say,
oh, sorry. So there's this tool called Mechanical Turk. Who's never heard of Mechanical Turk? You'll love this. So the 30-second version, Amazon needed a way to automatically tell real product reviews from fake ones that we'll be putting in as advertisement for different products. And so they made a system where they would get people to almost volunteer their time, like they would pay a penny, to read through a review and say, is it a real review or an advertisement for something else? And they made this infrastructure so well that they now publish that so that anybody can define a computer-based task that would take you a couple minutes and offer to pay people a penny or two to do that. And so this is what you mean me to tell you. So we use that extensively. So we can label our 17,000 cameras. We make a Mechanical Turk job that asks people to look at a couple pictures from our scene and say, are there trees? Is there a sky? Is there a beach? Is it in a city? And they click on 5 or 6 boxes helping us label that scene as our way of annotating this data set. And so one of those things is to draw a bounding box around places where there's trees.